Welcome everyone, and thank you for making the time to join us. This is an EY webcast. The topic tonight, of course, is mine closure, the challenges and opportunities. My name's Paul Mitchell. I have the honour of leading the EY Global Mining and Metals team, and I'm coming to you today from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. So most of you have probably seen the lands of the Aurora Nation. The elders used to meet at a place called Bennelong Point, and Bennelong Point is today where the Sydney Opera House sits. So that gives you a little bit of a clue as to where I am when we take a modern tongue. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to the elders for that pleasure. I have the honour of welcoming my co-presenters, Alison Brown from Barrick and Bjorn Weeks from Teck. I want to thank them for joining me. I'm very passionate about closure. It's a topic. I grew up in a mining state, so I grew up in Western Australia, and in the regional areas. And one of the things I was always told was to watch out for a lot of those holes in the ground and those dangers that existed out in regional Australia. And I think the legacy is something that we really have to think about in our industry. A lot of us aren't proud to say that we work in the mining and metals industry, and I think that the poor performance on legacy in the past is one of the results of that. But I'm very pleased to say that we're now doing a great job, and the two guests that are joining me are doing an outstanding job in terms of that. So maybe if I ask you to introduce yourselves and just perhaps why you're so passionate about mine closure. So Alison, would you like to go first?
Thanks very much, Paul. And yes, good morning, everyone. My name's Alison Brown, and I'm coming to you on the other side of the world from the town of West Kelowna in British Columbia, which is the traditional unceded lands of the Silex people out here in what we know as BC now today. Paul, that's interesting to hear that you grew up in Western Australia, because when I think about my own journey coming into the world of mine closure, it was not a direct route by any means. I grew up in a mining town. I have a father who was a mining engineer for his entire career. And I always saw living in a mining town, the prosperity that we got from mining, but also the impacts of mining and other natural resource development. And that was something that lit a fire in me and sent me down a path of studying environmental science and wanting to do the cleanup and do good from the inside on the mining industry. And so I worked in mining, and I've been with Barrick for nearly 20 years, so most of my career, but largely working in operational environmental management, really trying to change the way that miners think about managing the environmental impact of their work. And when I had an opportunity to come manage some legacy sites for Barrick, I thought that was an interesting opportunity, but I had no idea what I was getting into. And I think it's really come full circle for me, where I've now been able to apply my scientific background, but also my passion for working with communities, thinking creatively, and seeing the tangible positive impact of our work. So thank you very much for having me. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the things that I've learned over the last few years working in mine closure.
Thanks, Alison. Bjorn?
Yeah, well, I come at things very much from an engineering background. I graduated from the University of Manitoba with a bachelor's in civil engineering and a master's in environmental, and went straight into consulting, and immediately got tied up in waste management issues. And later on, when I went back to school and did my PhD through the Norman B. Keevil School of Mining here at University of British Columbia, I focused on mine waste management and a little bit of a Barrick connection there. A lot of the research was done at the old Placer Dome sites, including Kidston in Australia and the Equity Silver Mine in northern BC. And you asked about why we're passionate about it, and I think it's actually like one of the great intellectual challenges of our time. I mean, there's so few areas that are as necessary. Mining is a finite use of the land, and just incredibly multidisciplinary. I mean, no matter what your specialty, no matter what your skill background, you might have a base for mine closure, but you're going to have to stretch yourself hard to keep on learning about the complementary skills that are involved in doing it effectively and managing those legacy properties effectively. So it's just a perpetual challenge.
Absolutely. So yes, two guests from Vancouver, and we actually all met in Vancouver. So I serve. It's interesting you mentioned Placer and University of British Columbia. So I serve on the board of BRIM, which was founded by Peter Bradshaw, and we have our annual board meeting out at University of British Columbia, where a lot of the research takes place. And last year we hosted a meeting of mine closure specialists, so it was great to see everyone there and start to get a bit of a community going. Just quickly to take you through the agenda for our call, for our webcast today. So we're going to talk about mine closure and just a little bit about setting the base about what some of the issues are. We're then going to look at an integrated mine closure approach. I think these days people have realised that mine closure needs to start from when we design our mine, and so we'll talk about some of the ways that happens. Can't have an EY mining call without talking about risks and opportunities. Our top 10 report continues to get great feedback from you all, so we'll do a little bit of that, and then we'll talk about best practices. If we've got time, we'll do some Q&A, and so I hope we do have that today. So let me jump straight in. So I talked about the fact that we've had this group of mine closure specialists get together before, and I think there is a real community happening in terms of mine closure. Excuse me. I think, when we look at this challenge from the industry's perspective, closure continues to become one of those issues that just gets more and more publicity. I think as we've seen miners move to that position of realising how important responsible mining is. I think every time I hear CEOs talk now, safety comes up, but this concept of responsible mining also comes up really importantly. And so even though we've got that, we see that closure provisions and closure costs continue to rise all the time. Global mining companies are going to spend over $50 billion in managing and closing mines over the next 20 years. And that's an incredible thing. While it sounds like a lot of cost, there's also an opportunity. And I think there are real opportunities to create value, alternative value, both for our communities, but a broader range of stakeholders. And so hopefully we'll explore some of those today. Even though we're spending that 50 billion and we've provisioned that, expectations around closures continue to grow. And I think, one of the realizations that companies have got to is those commitments that they made to closure at the start of the mine aren't necessarily going to be enough for the communities that exist today or the expectations that all of our stakeholders have today. I think the days of thinking that we can close a mine in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years have gone. We're gonna need to monitor some of these sites for a lot longer than any of us are certainly going to live. And as those things go on, that's going to continue to create that. So we like to think about mine closure in terms of long-term value. So long-term value is this concept that value isn't just financial; that value can be measured in a number of other ways. So what we hope to do as we go through this agenda is explore some of those things, sort of work through what we're looking at, understand some of those perspectives, and really sort of work through. So I did talk about our risk and opportunity report, so I might sort of start there. When we did our survey last year, one of the questions we asked was, how many of the businesses that we surveyed have closure strategies in place for their operating assets? And less than 50% of them actually had strategies in place. And that number really surprised me. So I think maybe we'll start Bjorn with yourself and just get your reaction to that there's only closure strategies for 50% of mines.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, I was laughing because my initial reaction was the same as yours. I was like, just about fell out of my chair. I was like, how could that possibly be? But on a little bit more reflection, I'm not that surprised. It's easy working with and in large companies to forget that the industry is incredibly large, it's incredibly diverse, and there's many, many new or smaller players. And it does seem that companies need to be bitten hard by closure liabilities, maybe a couple of times before they learn to plan for them and take all that over and over again. That the client base for closure, it was the blue chip companies. It was the big companies that had gone through this and developed internal closure structures. That said, closure practitioners, we probably don't do the industry any favors because we tend to talk amongst ourselves and attend closure conferences, and there isn't necessarily that opportunity for outreach. You're not going to hear a lot about closure at a mining conference like PDAC, for example. So I think there's space there to get the message out and maybe have others learn from the hard-won experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's we've definitely seen that in terms of what's there. I think over the you talked about the fact that it's the large miners and that this is a relatively new issue in terms of what's there, and I think we've certainly seen changes in the way that people think about closure over the last sort of couple of years in terms of what's there, and certainly some innovations in terms of the way that some of these issues are managed. Alison, can you share with us how mine closure practices have shared over the period that you've been involved?
Yeah, for sure. And like I mentioned, I've worked in the industry for almost 20 years, which is slightly horrifying for me to admit. And honestly, sometimes it feels like when you're in the thick of it, that change is happening at a glacial pace. And I'm sure many closure practitioners feel like they're just banging their head against a wall. I often joke with my team that we're living Groundhog Day, the movie, at a lot of these projects, because we see the same issues over and over again. And sometimes it doesn't seem like we are changing. But reflecting back in preparation for this discussion, there have been some significant changes. And I think about when I started out working at Barrick's Hemlo mine in Ontario when I was just a young university student. There were no discussions about closure planning. There were no discussions even about what that mine was going to look like once it closed and what that meant for the community. So yes, there's a lot of exciting practices and technologies being developed for closure. And, I think that space is it's changing quickly. And I think we need to keep our finger on that pulse. But the two things I'm most excited about that I've seen in the last, let's say 10 years that have really started to change is that the industry is finally starting to accept that mining isn't an endpoint. Yes, it's the end of that mine's operation. It's the end of that use of the land. And we all know, again, I grew up in a mining town, so I know how impactful that can be when a mine ends. But there's a lot of people, especially our Indigenous groups, that have been using the land for other purposes, other very productive purposes for time immemorial. And we need to recognize that and really shift our closure planning mindset to, it's not about closing and walking away or divesting. It's about transitioning to that next phase of use. And I think that's where, we're also starting to see the shift in our view on legacy mines. And like most major miners, Barrick has legacy sites all over North America that we acquired through various mergers over the years. And in the past, and it wasn't that long ago, let's say 5 years ago, those sites were really viewed as a bit of a nuisance and a cash flow drain. And as you mentioned, Paul, there's now this shift happening where we're recognizing the value in a different way. Sometimes it's financial value, reprocessing tailings like we're doing at our Golden Sunlight mine. It's something that we're able to make money off and fund our reclamation activities and also provide a product that our operations need. But there's other value in these properties, and we need to start thinking more creatively about how we frame that value and how we communicate what that value is to our investors, shareholders, and the communities that host us.
Yeah, absolutely. Bjorn, I'll ask you to share your reflections on sort of evolutions and innovations too, but also it'd be great if you could share with the audience the role that you have with ICMM and some of the developments there as one of those.
Yeah, no, I've been lucky enough to connect with ICMM on a couple of different ways. Initially in 2018 as a consultant brought in to work on the update to the Good Practice Guide. And then later, once I joined Teck, had the opportunity to sit on the closure working group and be one of the co-chairs for that working group for a couple of years while that was stood up. And, ICM's had a fantastic role, not only reflecting the evolution of closure practice across the industry, but also in driving it, because they had a guidance document for closure back in 2008, and the membership at that time, or a decade later, the membership felt that document was getting a little bit out of date, and they really pushed the update to reflect a lot of the ideas that I think are now very well established in the industry around design for closure, objectives-based closure planning. And I think we did a really good job in writing that document and articulating those. And I think the surprising part of that whole process for me coming in as a consultant was I had a draft in my hands that spoke to the social aspects of closure. And my expectation was like, oh man, they're going to kill this. This is way too aspirational. There's no way the membership of the ICMM is going to be willing to take on this level of aspiration around social transition. And walking into a meeting with the then closure working group and having them push for more and set the bar even higher. And that was really, really a striking experience for me. And I think, spoke to the quite visionary status of the membership at that time, but also to an evolution that was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that we've seen a completely different ICMM over the last few years, and I think that particularly since sort of Ivan Arigata took over the presidency, I think we've seen some that view of responsible mining and beating targets has really come in, and I think I've always been one that sort of said net zero is just not ambitious enough, and to have ICMM come out and all of its members come out and talk about nature positive, I think has been fantastic, and I think that's something we really try and think about when we do planning for mine closure with people. So it's great. We've talked a little bit about closure through asset life cycles, and I think there's a couple of things we've sort of learned in a number of the projects we've done working with people on developing strategies and doing project feasibility studies for closure and that sort of thing. I think a couple of those I wouldn't mind sharing with people in terms of what's there. I think the number one I've seen over that period of time is the earlier you commence closure planning, the better position you'll be in. So I think if you can design a mine with closure in mind, you'll absolutely get benefit. And then most standards talk about having a project plan done sort of 10 years out. Numbers say that they do it 5, and then people often argue that well, when does a mine close? And I think that the sooner you can actually get that done, the better. In terms of what it does, there's a big value driver in that as well, because it enables you to integrate closure into some of your operational decision making. So those value trade-offs in terms of what's there are really important. I think then too, your closure plan needs to maintain optionality. So as we've Alison mentioned, there are other sources of value. So whether that's something that's obvious like reprocessing and being able to turn waste into value, or also create new businesses or create opportunities. Some of the infrastructure we've got around mines is incredible, and I think as infrastructure develops and as the world starts to think about things differently, that those opportunities to create value are going to change. And so I think one of the most important things to do is to keep that optionality alive as you sort of move through your closure planning. So if you do a growth study, you tend to lock in on a solution very quickly. But I think with a closure plan, you need to have some optionality maintained in terms of that. And the final one I've sort of seen is really making sure you gain input from as broad a range of stakeholders as possible. I think there was a time when we went to regulators only, and I think we've got much better at understanding that actually there's a much broader thing. Whether that's traditional owners, whether that's the community that's developed, and some of those things. And I think as we close some of the big mines that have operated in first world countries that are very close to big towns. You think of some of those towns in Utah that have built up around mining. You think of some of the ones in BC, and I think of some of the ones here in Western Australia and Queensland that are going to close. Those towns are going to exist. People are going to still want to live there. I remember driving through Whitnome 30 years after the mine had closed, and people still lived in that town because they loved it and they grew up there and they wanted to live there. So I think that keeping that broad range of stakeholders open is really important. Alison, anything else you'd add to in terms of just understanding that, that sort of life cycle and where to focus?
No, I think you hit on it really nicely. You obviously need to start thinking about closure right from the beginning, and I think it's something that maybe we don't do well as an industry because we're afraid to talk about it, or we don't know how to have those discussions with our communities. And again, I've kind of come into this field with a science background, but what I see increasingly is that we need to be exercising our soft skills and really working on kind of the social pieces of this, and working with our social performance teams and community development teams to start having those conversations. And it can be quite scary, but you're right. There's a lot of value that can be had by bringing other perspectives into the discussion and starting that early.
Yeah, absolutely. Bjorn?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that one thing that I would highlight within that context is the importance, and Alison touched on it, of the professionals. A lot of people in the closure space who are leading projects and design tend to come from a science and engineering background, which is great, but it's amazing what a social performance specialist can bring to the mix in terms of helping you develop tactics for going out to the community, managing internally, corporately, some of that fear factor that was alluded to about going out and having those conversations. Working at Tech, I've been super impressed with our social performance team and just the skills and professionalism they bring to it. And it's just kind of makes me think about when I try to do my own plumbing. It's not a good idea, right? Bring in the specialists. It's going to be worth the money spent.
Absolutely. Great. As I mentioned, we, I think, we talked about how many of the respondents said that they had plans for closure in terms of when we did our risk and opportunity survey. My team often sort of asks me, why doesn't closure make the top 10 list as one of the key things that we have on that list? And my response is always pretty simple. I always say, actually, closure is in pretty much half the risks that we have on that list. And I sort of reflect on it, and I reflect on this year's list. Capital, we have capital on the list. If we don't do closure right and we don't manage legacy, then access to capital is going to be extremely different. Environmental stewardship is on there. Resource reserve depletion's on there. We are going to get to these faster in terms of what's there. License to operate, obviously. So I think there are a number of those risks that come up there. And so I think, not having it on there specifically, I think is not a problem, because I think, if it was on there as a single faceted risk, we'd probably miss some of the ideas. And so I think being able to explain that closure is actually part of all of those things that everyone sees is really important, really highlights it to me in terms of where we're going. You both sort of talked about your broad experience in terms of this, and both from an educational perspective, but then from a work perspective. I won't say how many years I've been involved in the industry in terms of what's there. I think what I'd like to hear is just a little bit from you about the what you're able to share about the key challenges you've found in closing an asset. So maybe sort of reflect on an early one that had a key challenge, and maybe a newer one in terms of a key challenge, and just sort of what have been those things that you've actually had to deal with in terms of actually closing a mine or dealing with a legacy asset. So, Alison, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think I kind of touched on this already, but I did want to talk a little bit about the social closure aspect and share an example of a project that really lit the fire for me as far as mine closure goes. And again, I think, sometimes as closure practitioners, many of us are coming into this field either from that engineering or science background, or operations people who have then transitioned into reclamation and then post-closure management. But like Bjorn said, bringing in professionals to help us get aligned with our stakeholders, whether those are internal decision makers, which we all know can sometimes be our toughest customers when you're talking about resourcing these closure projects. Regulators, communities, even NGOs and other interested parties, it can be a real challenge. And I think that, what we're seeing more and more, and, this isn't the case for all of my closure projects, but oftentimes developing the technical solutions is the easy part of the work. So one project where, I think I had to learn the hard way that we were only going to succeed if we had those stakeholders involved right from the beginning was here in British Columbia. We had a legacy site that Barrick acquired through the Homestake merger in 2001. It's called Giant Nickel. It was an old nickel mine that operated, from the 1930s until 1974 when it shut down. So by the time Barrick entered the picture, Giant Nickel had already been closed by Homestake. The work that they did was award-winning at the time. The tailing storage facility that was there was basically given a clean bill of health from the BC government at that time and almost given permission to be relinquished, which would have been a first in the province. But when Barrick came into the picture in 2001, obviously we have our own robust tailings management standard, and we started looking at all of our tailings facilities in our legacy portfolio and realized that we had some work to do at Giant Nickel to bring that facility up to our standards. And, being the miners and the problem solvers that we are, we rushed headfirst into how do we engineer this thing? How do we get this done as quickly as possible? We're going to build this beautiful buttress and come up with all these lovely diversion ditches. And, I remember sitting in offices in Vancouver with our engineer of record, and we thought we had the most brilliant project design ever. We were so proud of it and we were ready to go. And at that time, we were also looking at a repurposing of the site, which involved, some pretty out there ideas. One of the ideas that was floated and in discussion with the community was turning the site into a ski hill. And so we were, by virtue of talking about alternate land use for this area, talking to our local communities, local First Nations, other representatives from other government agencies. And what we found out was that there were a lot of people with a lot of interest in that site, and their vision for that site was completely different than ours. We had people using the land for recreation. There was a huge dirt bike trail network that had been set up and campgrounds. BC Hydro had an interest in the area because their main power lines to Vancouver go right through our tailings facility. We had forestry companies, and then we had First Nations who had concerns about the way the land was left. So when we realized that, it was quite scary at the time, but we realized we had to go back to the drawing board and really open up that closure plan and start having discussions about what we could do to meet as many of those stakeholders' needs as possible. Obviously, not everybody is going to be happy with that many people with so many different perspectives. But what we did was we worked for a couple of years and really, threw spaghetti at the wall and came up with, well, what do we do here? What are the main priorities for this site? And obviously, safety of that tailings facility was one, but maintaining access to the land was another one for a number of users. And then for the First Nations, their primary concern was that there were some impacts to water, but mostly it was a visual impact. And they wanted to see that addressed. And we hadn't even thought about that because, we're meeting the environmental requirements at the time. So we thought we were good. But in the end, we worked that plan. We got it permitted. We got it approved. We executed it over a 2-year period. And that project, to me, like anybody that worked on that project was so moved by it because it was so meaningful. We had all local employees working on the project. We gave most of our work back to the community of Hope, which is, used to be a resource town and now doesn't have much going on. We addressed the concerns of most of the stakeholders. And what's really exciting for me to see now is those dirt bike riders. We set them up with a nice little campground where we had been doing our quarrying activities, and they've become so protective of the site. They've become like the informal de facto owners of our tailings facility. They call me up and they call our site manager up to let us know when things are going on that they don't think looks right. So the the ownership and the pride that people have taken in that site because of our engagement, I think, was a really big lesson learned for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. I think your comment that sticks with me is, not everyone is going to be 100% satisfied. And I think, there has to be compromises in terms of what's there. And I think, if you try and start that 2 months out, you just, you're never going to get there in terms of what's there. I think, we've been working on some legacy sites in France because the rehabilitation plan was to take it back to what it was. And the local community was like, no, hang on, we want farms. We don't want it to go back to that. We'll have so much work to do to turn this into arable farmland. Please don't do that to us. And I think those compromises and what you can do are really important. Bjorn?
Yeah, so I think on that theme of key challenges, one of the things that came to mind for me, you mentioned earlier in your comments, Paul, about managing the life cycle of the mine, and that's important. I also think in closure, it's become incredibly important to manage the hype cycle. And by that, I mean, over the course of my time working in this, which is spanning more than 2 decades now, we've seen over and over again that things come up and grab the enthusiasm of the industry. In the 90s, it was cover design, which I got very much involved in. And, it's like, well, with covers, we're going to solve everything. We're going to stop acid rock drainage. We close our mines with covers. We just have to get better and better at covers. And we've got all these new tools to do cover design. It was the solution to everything. And yeah, obviously now in retrospect, it wasn't the solution to everything. Or passive water treatment was another one that had like a huge hype cycle, again, in about that period of time where it was like, we're not going to need treatment plants anymore. Everything can be done passively. They're natural systems. They're beautiful. Also not the solution to everything, and at the risk of, getting attacked after this call, geomorphic landform design, also not the solution to everything. Design for closure. None of these things by themselves are the solution to everything. But the thing is that they are a solution to something. And the trick is to slice through that over egging of expectations and to find the right applications and to find the right uses for these things and to see where these concepts can be intelligently applied and combined with a whole multidisciplinary, multi-pronged approach to closure, get the results that you need. And I think those cycles and those enthusiasms are going to keep on coming. I haven't had anyone try to sell me AI for mine closure yet, but I'm sure it's coming, and it's, another hype cycle. And I think for people with more experience and more time in the profession, the trick is to be live to things, because there are changes in technology. There are things we want to jump on soon and adopt and get into, but not get completely baffled by it and, be able to see that there's going to need to be a little more subtlety in our response to the challenges ahead of us.
Absolutely. Maybe some thoughts about some specific internal stakeholders. I think they're often often the questions that closure people ask to me is how to manage sort of different internal stakeholders in terms of what's there. And I think one of the most important ones is obviously the CFO. And when we look at the closure provision, there have been significant increases in the past couple of years, and I think we have seen some great improvements there. I think discounted cash flow does hide a lot of problems though. When we're sort of thinking about closure in terms of what's there. I think what sort of advice do you give to the CFO when they sort of come to you and they say, provision's rising, how can we manage this? What are the things we can do? What sorts of pieces of advice do you give to the CFO? Maybe start with yourself, Bjorn.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem across the industry. And I think that's actually one of the first parts of the conversation is to say, hey, it's not just us. Look at the benchmarking, look at what's happening to all the mining companies. As we gain this experience with what it really costs to close a site, that naturally tends to bring costs up. But I think you have to manage that with a little bit of a dialectic in the sense that yes, you have this experience, and yes, you have these rising costs that better reflect the experience. But at the same time, I think you need to have a fairly ruthless view at cost control and say, hey, if this is so material, we need to bring all of our resources and all of our critical thinking to bear on this. You know, the analogy I'd use is, say you decide to put a fence around your yard, and it turns out it costs $1 million. Well, one response to that is, wow, fences are expensive. I better budget a lot more for fences, right? Another response might be, why on earth is it costing $1 million? You know, maybe I shouldn't have just got one quote. You know, maybe I should be looking at what this fence is made of. Maybe there's a better approach that is going to get the same result. And, you know, it's that old definition of an engineer, which is somebody who can do with $1,000 what any fool can do with 10,000. So I think there's space for that hard engineering. And I think as the costs get more material and they get closer, there's a lot more motivation. You know, if you think you're walking towards $100 million closure, it's quite a different mindset than if you think you might be stumbling towards $1 billion closure. So I think bringing those technical resources in to see what can we really do here to effectively use resources is an argument that CFOs and everyone in business really should be receptive to. And the other thing I'll just add on that as well, one other small point, is that closure costs, you are planning for the very far future. And the reality is, it's a large project. We're not that great at planning for the cost of any large projects. And I'm not just saying as an industry, I'm saying in general, most mega projects do go significantly over budget. And if you add in a factor of 20 or 30 or 40 years, you're really getting into an untenable situation. And the AACE put out a document on estimating long-range costs for planning applied to the public sector, which could have been written for closure, because they bring in all this idea of how people get anchored on the early estimates. They forget that the scope has changed dramatically. It's highly relevant for what we're doing.
Absolutely. I think probably the other one, the one I then get asked about next is boards, and just, you know, how do you answer questions from boards? Are there any sort of left field questions you've had from boards about closure that, you know, and how you've responded to them that you'd be able to share with the audience?
Is that one for Alison or for me? Sorry.
Happy for either of you. Why don't you go first, Bjorn?
I would actually say no, nothing left field. I'm actually quite impressed with the board conversations I've had. You know, they tend to be very astute, experienced individuals who are alive to the issues. You know, they want to know that their appropriate resources are in place. They are thinking about the long term. I think it's just a matter of being able to bring the issues up in an appropriate executive summary lesson and focus in on the key risks for a team of people that are looking at a whole bunch of risks across the entire business.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I also can't think off the top of my head of any really wild questions I've had to field from the board, but I think what's encouraging for me is we do have regular conversations with our CEO about closure, and he initiates those conversations. And
Right.
You know, oftentimes it's our senior leaders within Barrick that are coming to me and saying, where can we invest differently today so we don't end up with these long tail liabilities that we know are coming? And I think, you know, back to the point of why we're seeing these trends and increasing costs, I think there's a few drivers there. One is, you know, we get our closure assumptions incorrect, which is something that I think Bjorn kind of alluded to with the engineering levels. And, you know, maybe that's a lack of knowledge, but sometimes I think it's just a refusal of the facts. People don't want to accept the fact that closure does cost money. You know, obviously expectations change over time, and work is just more expensive in the future than it is today. So that really should be driving the discussions with our senior leaders and our board about how do we head that off? How do we build a long-term value for this organization that, you know, closure is a part of that value. It's not just something that we're discounting into the future or not wanting to talk about or pretending isn't going to come at us. Because I think if we've learned anything over the last couple of decades, it's that closure doesn't just go away quietly. It gets worse if it's not dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. I talked before about some of the transitions that are going to be difficult. Those ones sort of built near towns and those sort of things. And I think just transition is something that has probably been done on a small scale to date, but it hasn't been done on a major scale. Have either of you had any sort of success with transitioning workforce or transitioning towns or understanding what's there? Just some lessons learned in terms of that, Alison?
Sure. Yeah, I can start. Barrick has had to close several mines in the last 5 years. We had our Buzwagi mine over in Tanzania close in 2020, Golden Sunlight, which is in Montana, Purina, which is in Peru, and Long Canyon, which is in Nevada. So we've had quite a spread over the last few years of closures, and they're all in different stages today. But really our approach to the kind of social transition aspect of that is built around our three pillars, which is to repurpose infrastructure, which you mentioned, Paul. Mining brings a lot of good infrastructure into regions that may not otherwise have had that investment. So we've got, energy, water, transportation networks. We need to make sure that those are handed over to the communities and done so in a way that they can take over the management and continue to effectively use those things. We also work on diversifying the local economies, and we do that through our community development committees, where we start those conversations about what can we invest into today in the community that's going to help ease this transition for you guys. And that includes the workers at our mines. And, I think the third thing that we focus on and probably need to do more of is thinking about those employees at our mines, because we've been a little bit lucky with Buzwagi and Long Canyon in that we had other operating mines very close by that we could, get our workers to move over to should they desire to stay in the mining industry and continue working with Barrick, or send them off to their next job with a great skill set that they developed while working for Barrick. But again, I don't know that we do enough of that. And, I think it's on us again as closure practitioners to start working with our site human resources teams and really identifying how do we upskill this workforce and start developing plans for them to get them jobs elsewhere or help them transition to a different industry if that's what the reality is where they are. And, in some cases, even incentivize them to stay and work in closure. I've been really lucky with my team of closure practitioners that a lot of the people that are still managing our legacy sites came to us from operations, and they're very passionate about those sites and the issues in the communities. And if we can identify those champions, we're going to have amazing workers for a long time to come.
Absolutely. Bjorn?
Yeah, it sounds like some very similar experiences. In the tech portfolio, one site that I think is a fantastic example of that, and that we can be very proud of, is our Sullivan site. And that's a site that, they started thinking about closure and doing reclamation trials back in the 70s. And when closure came at the end of the 90s, in 2000, 2001, they implemented closure in that. There have been nearly a decade of planning for closure, including the community, including planning for economic diversification. And I mean, if you look at it just from the standpoint of the town of Kimberley today, it's a beautiful community with a thriving, diversified economy. Some of the memory of the mine is maybe receding from front and center, but there was a lot that was done to support that diversification. There's top-ranked golf courses there. There's the ski resort. And when you look back, it's like it didn't have to be a success story, right? That could have turned out very badly. You could have just another post-mining community that looks kind of like bleak and has suffered that post-mining crash. And I think for me, the key lesson learned in that was there were individuals that really drove things. There were passionate people that saw what was coming, had seen the lessons from other sites, and were determined to do something different and something better with that site. And, we have all the guidance documents. There's something special about mine closure that generates guidance documents. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's even the guidance document to the guidance documents out there now. You can have all the guidance documents in the world, but it really takes people doing the hard yards and thinking about what's needed and putting things into action to make a difference on the ground. And I think Kimberly and the Sullivan closure was a good example of, people who are long retired now who are thinking about the future and really drove good results there.
Excellent. I mean, clearly you both got a lot of experience in terms of closure and those sort of things. I guess, any additional sort of real life lessons or experiences that you want to share? I just wouldn't want to miss the opportunity, given we've got you both on, just to see if there's any additional ones of those.
Go ahead, Bjorn. I'm sure you have lots.
There are lots. We talk a lot about design for closure, and I think that everyone kind of agrees that it's a good thing, but it can be tough to see what that actually looks like on the ground when you're like contemplating the development stage of a new project and potentially billions of dollars of investment and economics that aren't necessarily as favorable as they could be. I think it's worthwhile looking at some of the cases where sites actually were designed for closure and it made a huge difference. Dipping into the tech portfolio again, our Polaris mine site, which was very far north, very remote, the design of that mine allowed for really phenomenal closure outcomes. That mine could have been constructed, again, it's like things didn't have to work out well. It could have had a traditional tailings facility with dams that we need to get up there, and inspect and monitor nonstop forever. They found a way to use a non-productive meromictic deep lake for tailings disposal. That site, again, another site that's been closed almost 20 years, it's virtually invisible, right? Like there's no real, you need a GPS to know where the mine was. And there's really, we go and check on it every few years now. It really does have a lot of potential to be relinquished at the end. And really, that's all an outcome of the mine design. It wasn't like anyone did anything clever for closure design in the last years of it. It was like the mine design was worked out to bring things in after you. And, if you look around the industry, there's other examples of that popping up now. I think Rio Tinto's Diavik mine is a great one. I was able to work on the closure plan for that as a consultant. And they built that mine thinking about its closure. And they kept the eyes on that prize through its entire operation. And now it's coming into closure. They're pointing in the direction of getting some very good results there because they did the hard yards up front on what does closure of the site look like.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think they're both great ones in terms of examples. Hey, conscious we've just got a few minutes left. I think a couple of last questions I want to ask. Maybe one on innovation, and then maybe we might ask you both to just finish with some key pieces of advice. So I think innovation. I mean, you're both obviously involved in the research and involved in sort of different things. And when I think of innovation, I think of some of the things we're doing. I think some of the things I have seen at University of British Columbia and at BRIM. About collaboration with the medical department, using microbiology, whether it's to calcify tailings, whether it's to treat water, whether it's to do some waste to value projects in terms of what's there. And I think that we often complain about the fact that collaboration doesn't happen. I think some of the work that I've seen at BRIM and University of British Columbia around collaboration between medical researchers and mining engineers has been fantastic and really about some fantastic examples. I think, I'm sure you've both got examples of what you've seen, and maybe Alison, if we start with yourself.
Sure. Yeah, and I think UBC and BRIM are a great example, but so is UQ and some of the work that's been going on in Australia through the SMI. I think we need to bring those perspectives into the mining industry, because it's always amazing to me when I meet with, different specialists from different universities, and they've just got such a forward-looking view that I think aligns so nicely with what we do in closure, because what we're trying to do is design for the future, come up with these resilient new closure strategies that, quite honestly, you go into it sometimes not having any idea what you're going to come up with, and the outcomes are just incredible. I will say, on the heels of our tailings reprocessing project in Montana, and knowing that tailings reprocessing was something that Barrick's, Randgold, who merged with Barrick 5 years ago, that they do a lot of in Africa. We've started looking at all of our tailings storage facilities, knowing that there's this push for critical minerals. And obviously, we've still got work to do on tailings management from a geotechnical standpoint, but the opportunity to go in and investigate and sample these tailings facilities and see if there's anything mineable that we could process and sell, or package up as a value add for somebody that may be interested in redeveloping the site. That's something that we're working on, but it's challenging, and we do need those experts to help us understand, because we're a gold and copper company. We don't know what to do with lithium or cobalt, so we need people to help us understand what those streams could be, and where the markets might be at today, and even how to quantify what that value is.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, we're sort of coming towards the end in terms of the hour. I think there's a lot of people on here who either are part of the closure community, or I think are sort of thinking about their own closure journey, either as a business or as an individual. And I think, I'd just like to ask you both to finish with, what's the piece of advice you'd like to give people about, how to maintain the passion, how to get the most out of what you're doing? What would you tell yourself sort of 20 years ago in terms of getting into this, and given what you know today?
Go ahead, Bjorn. And don't say run.
No, it's a great area to work in, and maybe going back to like one of the themes that we couldn't help but make throughout this, there's a wide range of possible outcomes for every site, and you can have a huge influence on what the actual outcome is, which should be a tremendously inspiring thing, right? Like, because this is like a space where you really can make a difference, and your closure can be a financial and social disaster, right? That's a known outcome. It's happened before. Or it can be a remarkable success story, and that's happened as well. And you've got a lot of agency over which way things go. Of course, the earlier you start, the more you can influence the outcomes. So you should start now. Now is always the right time to start, no matter where you are in the process. And I think the other thing I would say is to recognize that as a class of activities, human activities, closure is a project. It's a big project. So all the things that we learn about big projects, Bent Flyberg's incredible book, How Big Things Get Done, it applies directly to closure. So, make things as modular as possible. Progressive closure is a great way to try things out and learn, and realize that your project's not unique. There's lots of closure out there. There's an astounding amount of information in the literature today compared to where we were at in the early 90s. So really do everything you can to learn from other people's experiences and bring that into making a difference on your project, whatever it is you have in front of you.
Absolutely. Alison?
Sure, I'll try and keep this brief, but I think the one skill that I've benefited the most from working in closure is that I'm very stubborn. I think when you talk about these closure projects, again, they're very long duration, and sometimes it's hard to see the progress because it takes time. But don't give up. I think surrounding yourself with people who are as excited about the work as you are is really important. And there's a lot of us. And, to both of your points earlier, I don't think we do enough to share the good work, but also the examples of where things have gone wrong, because I think that's where, you can really motivate a whole new group of people. I've had general managers come out, our GMs from operating mines come out to some of our legacy sites, and they look at those sites and they say, had I known this was what was going to be left at the end, I would have done things differently. So I think, sharing the good, the bad, the ugly, and being very tenacious in our work is where it can really start to pay dividends. But I agree, I think mine closure is one of the more exciting parts of the mining life cycle, and definitely we're looking for good people and anybody that's got passion, and there's so many unique skill sets that we need. I think there's a place for everybody in the work that we do.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I might just finish on, we're going to distribute. We've got some slides that sort of talk a little bit about what we're doing and show some of the data that we've collected, that we've sort of been using in the background. I think it's always much better to look at people on a webcast than look at a bunch of slides. So I decided not to show them. So I'm going to send those out. But at the back of that pack, we've got a link to the ICMM guide that Bjorn mentioned. So if you did want to have a read of that, it's actually really interesting to look at the breadth and some of the advice in there. I think there's some very good things in there. But also we've got some links to some university courses. So, we talked about the fact that we need to have closure professionals in terms of what's there. And I think, we're seeing some fantastic advancements in that. Curtin University are running courses, and UBC are running courses, and so we've got some links. There's a couple of those courses that are coming on in the next couple of months. So thank you to both Curtin and to UBC for putting those on. If you're interested, there are still places available, and I'd recommend that you sort of grab those. So just the final bit I'd like to do is thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoyed that. We haven't had time to do the Q&A, but we've grabbed the questions that we've got, and we'll respond to you individually. In terms of then, some of the questions might be answered in the pack we send out. So have a little look at the pack we send out to that. Alison, Bjorn, thank you both very much. I think you both certainly bring some passion to this topic, and some different views as well, which I think is fantastic. I think it's good to get some different perspectives in terms of that. I think it's Vancouver's become a bit of a centre for closure for me, and it's certainly something I always think of when I'm there. So look forward to seeing you both when I'm back there next year. So thanks everyone. All the best. Enjoy your closure journey, and thank you again. Thanks everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.